Who is Vladimir Lenin? Vladimir Lenin, founder of the Russian Communist Party and leader of the Bolshevik Revolution. He was also the founder of the Soviet state and inspired the ideas of Leninism after his death. About Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir was born on April 22, 1870, and in 1901 took the title of Lenin during his secret party activity. Lenin was from a family with a high educational and cultural level, and 6 brothers each had a relative role in revolutionary work. In 1887, his older brother Alexander was executed for joining a group that was planning to assassinate Emperor Alexander III. Lenin attended the same year at Kazan University to study law, but was dismissed during the first semester because of his participation in a student demonstration. Lenin devoted his energy to the service of revolutionary policy, but his revolutionary activity was soon revealed. He was arrested in 1895 and exiled to Siberia for 3 years. After leaving exile, he began his leading role in the revolutionary movement. During the second meeting of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in 1903, Lenin called for the formation of a society led by a contemporary party so efficient that it could mobilize the lower party organizations and their workers. The war with Japan in 1904 had a role in that, where people of all sects were exhausted. The situation reached its climax on January 9, 1904, when a number of workers of the isolated city of Petersburg marched to seize his emperor, whom he encountered by force and killed hundreds of them. This forced him to issue the official October Statement, which stipulated a number of concessions, but Lenin was not convinced at all of the emperor's concessions. Lenin believed that the comprehensive truth revolution should be led by the workers who represent the working class in the state. But the Mensheviks saw that Lenin's ideas were in fact a prelude to the creation of a dictator who would extend his authority over those who claimed to exert power in their hands. Tarnay's party until the party meeting in Prague in 1912, when Lenin formally split and established a separate new entity. Lenin was again disavowed during the First World War. In 1917, Russia's Tsarist overthrew its starving and war-ravaged citizens. Lenin returned to his country and soon announced his opposition to the new interim government as if he were feeling his way to power. This government was formed by a group of party leaders, liberal bourgeoisie, as an alternative to this government. Lenin called for the formation of a Soviet government directly administered by soldiers, peasants and workers of the people. In late 1917, Lenin led the October Revolution, but it was only a coup d'état that resulted in a 3-year civil war in which Lenin acknowledged the politics of red terrorism that paved the way for a vicious campaign led by Lenin to eliminate his civilian opponents. Lenin defeated his opponents despite many, but he failed to build the state he had always dreamed of leading, as Lenin's Russia was collapsing because of the civil war that his regime helped to break out. Lenin suffered a stroke in 1922, followed by another stroke in December of the same year. In March 1923, Lenin suffered another stroke after suffering an additional stroke that resulted in his ability to speak and make political decisions. He was then given 10 months on January 21 in 1924. To honor his status in Russian society, his body was mummified and placed in a mausoleum in Moscow's Red Square. The beginnings of Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Ulyanov was born on April 22, 1870, in the Russian city of Simbirsk, later renamed Ulyanovsk. In 1901, Vladimir took the title of Lenin during his secret party activity. Lenin was from a family with a high level of education. Lenin was the third son of his parents, and his relationship with them and his 6 brothers was close. The school was an important part of Lenin's life as a child. His parents had a high level of culture and education, and their children, especially their son Vladimir, had a love of knowledge from childhood. His reading passion was superior to his high school colleagues. Unusual in Latin and Greek proficiency, destiny dictated that Lenin and his family live in a long-lasting life. Two positions were particularly influential in shaping his life. The first position during his youth, when his father, a school inspector, was threatened with early retirement by a government official concerned about the impact of public schools on Russian society. The second and most tragic situation was in 1887 when his older brother Alexander, a university student, was arrested and executed for joining a group that was planning to assassinate Emperor Alexander III. Lenin became his only family member when his father died, and his brother's activity in the political opposition was not unusual for his family. Lenin's brothers had a relative role in revolutionary work. Lenin enrolled in the year of his brother's execution at Kazan University to study law. But his stay at the university did not last long because he was dismissed during the first semester because of his participation in a student demonstration. Lenin denied his grandfather's estate in the village of Kukushkino, where he lived with his sister Anna, whom the police forced her to stay in because of her suspicious activity. Lenin was in that period reading a collection of works of revolutionary literature, including the novel by Nikolai Chernyshevsky, known as What Is to Be Done. The novel deals with the story of a man named Rakhmaitov, who decided to devote his life to the goal of service revolutionary politics. Lenin also indulged in the writings of Karl Marx, the German philosopher of the famous book Kapital or Das Kapital, which had a profound influence on Lenin's thought. In 1889, Lenin declared that he had become Marxist. Lenin eventually got a degree in law after graduating from university in 1892 and then moved to Samara. The majority of those who belonged to him belonged to the Russian peasant class. The struggle of these peasants against the class legal system, from Lenin's point of view, was to strengthen Lenin's ideas of Marxism in himself. The achievements of Vladimir Lenin devoted his energy to the service of revolutionary politics, leaving the city of Samara in the mid-1890s to live a new life in St. Petersburg, the Russian capital at the time, where Lenin contacted other Marxists who shared the same ideas and began to play more effective roles in their revolutionary activity. However, Lenin and his revolutionary comrades were soon exposed and arrested along with other Marxist leaders in December 1895, where he was exiled to Siberia for 3 years, and was later executed by his fiancée and his future wife, Nadezhda Khrushchevskaya. After his departure from exile and his time in Munich, where Lenin and others co-founded the newspaper Iskra to unite the ranks of Marxists in Europe and Russia, Lenin returned to the city of St. Petersburg, where he began his leading role in the revolutionary movement. During the second meeting of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in 1903, the enthusiastic young Lenin called for the formation of a society led by a modern party so efficient that it could mobilize the lower party organizations and their workers. His words were, "Give us an organization of revolutionaries, and we will turn Russia upside down," he said. In 1904, Russia entered into a war with Japan. The war had a profound impact on Russian society, where the repeated defeats had strained Russia's domestic budget, prompting citizens of all denominations to express their anger at the political system in the state and called for reform. The situation reached a climax on January 9, 1904, when a number of workers of the isolated city of Petersburg marched to Caesar Nicholas II to make a petition to the emperor directly. The security forces confronted these workers and shot them, killing and injuring hundreds of them. In 1905, in an attempt to calm his compatriots, the emperor issued the official October Statement, which provided for a number of political concessions, most notably the establishment of an elected legislature called the Duma. Lenin was not convinced at all of the concessions made by the emperor, and his Marxist comrades, especially the so-called Mensheviks and its leader Yul Smartov, were displeased. Their discussions centered on the party structure and the driving forces of a revolution that enabled them to extend their control over Russia. They believed power should remain in the hands of the bourgeois. Lenin was reluctant to express his lack of confidence in that class of people. Lenin felt that the comprehensive truth revolution, which could result in a socialist revolution that could extend outside Russia, must be its leaders of workers representing the class ADHH in their state. But the Mensheviks saw that Lenin's ideas were in fact a prelude to the creation of a dictator who would extend his authority over those who claimed to have power in their hands. The dispute between the two sides has continued since the second meeting of the party, the Lenin Prague in 1912, when Lenin officially broke up and created a separate new entity. Lenin was again deposed during the First World War, and his time in Switzerland was, as usual, his thinking on revolutionary politics. During this period he wrote his book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, 1916, where he discussed the inevitability of war because of the sovereignty of capitalism on an international scale. Lenin returned to his country and soon declared his opposition to the new interim government as if he was feeling his way to power. This government was formed by a group of leaders of liberal bourgeois parties. As an alternative to this government, Lenin to the formation of a Soviet government directly administered by soldiers, peasants and workers of the people. In late 1917, Lenin led the movement, which was soon known as the October Revolution, but it was only a coup that resulted from a 3-year civil war. The Soviet government led by Lenin faced enormous challenges. The anti-Soviet forces, the so-called Whites, who were fighting to overthrow Lenin's communist regime. Most of the leaders of these forces were former generals and naval commanders loyal to the Tsar, and they also used the Allied forces in World War I, who supplied them with money and soldiers. Lenin was determined to win no matter what the price, as he seemed ruthless in his quest to maintain power. Lenin acknowledged what was known as the politics of red terrorism, which paved the way for a campaign led by Lenin to eliminate its opponents of civilians. Lenin escaped miraculously from an assassination attempt in 1918, where he was seriously wounded by 2 shots fired by a political rival. Lenin recovered after admitting that he was impressed by his fellow citizens who had become very proud of him. But his health was no longer the same. Lenin, despite many of them, defeated his opponents, but failed to build the state he had long dreamed of leading. His insistence on the opposition, which would have wished for Russia to be in the orbit of the capitalist European system, was the beginning of the international isolation phase of Lenin's government. Lenin's Russia was free from any class struggle or international wars that resulted from this conflict. Despite all this, Russia under Lenin's leadership was disintegrating because of the civil war that his regime helped to break out. Hunger and poverty prevailed in most parts of Russian society. By 1921, Lenin faced the peasant revolution that led them to power. Strikes spread across cities and rural areas, the stability of the Lenin government. In an attempt to reduce political tension, Lenin adopted a new economic policy that allowed workers to sell their grain on the open market. The most famous words of Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin's personal life. Vladimir Lenin married Nadezhda Krupskaya on 10 July 1898, after their meeting in Siberia. The death of Vladimir Lenin. Lenin suffered a stroke in 1922, followed by another stroke in December of the same year, and with the apparent deterioration in his health, Lenin's thinking shifted to what the new Soviet Union would assume after he died. It was clear to him that his party and his government had deviated from their revolutionary goals. In early 1923, Lenin issued what Lenin had said was Lenin's regret over the dictatorial rule that dominated the Soviet government. Stalin's Secretary-General Joseph Stalin was the most disappointed figure, already began to gain significant powers in the party. In March 1923, Lenin's health was dealt a further blow by an additional stroke that enabled him to speak and make political decisions. He was then 10 months away on January 21, 1924 in the village now known as Gorky Leninisky, Russian society. His body was mummified and placed in a mausoleum in Moscow's Red Square. Fast facts about Vladimir Lenin. Lenin survived an assassination attempt in 1918. He had no confidence in Stalin, and especially when he saw his rapid rise in the ranks of the Communist Party. He believed he had an authoritarian ambition in power. His brother was hanged on charges of engaging in covert activity aimed at assassinating the emperor.